Hello and welcome back to my Nirvana channel. Today, once again, I'm joined by author and researcher Ralph Ellis, who's here today to talk about the current situation in the Ukraine. So, Ralph, can you enlighten us as to how the current situation in the Ukraine mirrors that of the battle for power in first century Odessa?
Yes, I wrote about this a couple of weeks ago because I saw some interesting parallels. And of course, we should be learning from history, and the history of Odessa is very, very similar to the modern events in Ukraine. And it also sets the scene for why we had this sort of gospel event, you know, the Jewish revolt and the role of Odessa within the Roman Empire. So how is it similar? Okay, so Odessa was this small principality stuck between Persia, Parthia, and Rome. And so we had a standoff here. Initially, the situation was different because Odessa tried to take over Rome with the Jewish revolt. That failed. And then Rome came back in with its legions, and Odessa was pushed back, and it then became the sandwich, the meat in this empire sandwich. And so we had this standoff because Rome wanted to destroy Odessa because Odessa had been a pain in the ass to the Roman Empire. They'd started a revolt on the eastern borders, and Rome wanted to punish them. But they couldn't because they were related to the Parthians, who were just next door. Therefore, they were protected in some respects by the Parthians. And therefore, if Rome went in against Odessa to punish Odessa, then Parthia was going to surely join in and prevent that incursion into Odessa. So Rome was stuck. They couldn't actually do what they wanted. Very, very similar to what should have been the Ukrainian situation. Well, the Ukrainian situation as it's been for the last 10 years. The difference being the peace lasted in Odessa for 2 centuries. So they managed to stay in this median position between these two empires, playing one against the other, favoring one and then favoring the other. Every time someone came up to their borders, they would favor the other empire, and which is why they became known as the fickle Odessans or the perfidious Odessans, because you couldn't trust them. And you couldn't trust them because they were always playing one empire against the other. If Rome came up to the borders, they ran to Parthia for some assistance. If Parthia came up, then they were friends with Rome. And you can imagine that their situation, because they could be wiped out in 2 minutes by any of these empires. But none of these empires, Rome and Parthia, wanted to engage each other. And so, in essence, they became happy with this buffer state between the two because it prevented any fraction between these two empires. Because these two empires had gone to war on many occasions before Odessa was set up, and in fact, even after Odessa was set up, because before Odessa was set up, because Mark Antony also lost a couple of legions there as well. And so it suited these two parties to have this buffer state between the two. And that's exactly what we have in the Russia-Europe or the Russia-America situation, with Ukraine stuck in the middle. So it's a very, very similar situation. The only difference is that one of the empires has been pushed or decided to, however you look at it, to actually take over the buffer state. And so instead of lasting for 2 centuries, Poor old Ukraine has only lasted for about 10 years as a buffer state. And now we have a rather desperate situation on the eastern borders of Europe at present.
Mm. Yeah, it's a fantastic analogy, and it reminds me of a Mark Twain quote. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme.
It does rhyme indeed, yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So I come across an Edward Snowden quote from yesterday. He said, the narratives repeated in the Western media are so thunderingly pro-Ukrainian and anti-Putin that it is hard to extract from the simplistic framing the complex nature of the conflict. And that's the trouble a lot of people have that I've spoken to about this situation is it's very hard to know who can we trust in the media to tell us the actual facts of the situation.
Very few. The trouble is the media has disgraced themselves on so many occasions, just in the talks that we've been having, with their disinformation, their misinformation continually, not even checking basic facts, or even then fact-checking facts to say they are true when they are patently false, and still giving those false facts. So I despair with what is known now as the legacy media. They are no longer the mainstream media because they no longer represent us. So they're now known as the legacy media as against the new media, because they've lied too often. And if they've lied in the past on so many occasions, how can you trust them with current events when now we're going to much more momentous events than previous ones? But if you can't trust them on climate, if you can't trust them on COVID, if you can't trust them on truckers in Canada and all of the various other things that have happened over the past few years, how can you trust them with this sort of situation? Now, we know when it comes to wars that, you know, people give out a little bit of disinformation, or they cover up events until maybe later on because they don't want to give away what's actually happening on the ground. But nevertheless, the legacy media have proved themselves to be utter liars. And in this sort of situation, they might have actually done a disservice in pushing Putin into taking this action, because of course he would not have gone forward with this plan if he thought that there was going to be severe resistance. So he's been waiting there. These troops have been there for over a year now, sitting there and waiting. So it's been in the planning for 2-3 years, this. And he was just looking for the right time to make his move. And you have to ask yourself if the media have actually allowed him to make that move.
Yeah, that kind of sort of answers really my next question, which was going to be, is the timing of this incident relevant given the recent collapse of the official COVID narrative and the truckers' protest in Canada? So
yes, I think there's a whole series of events. It's never one event, of course, that pushes you into a particular action, but there's a whole series of events. There was the, would you call it wokeization of the US military, where the US military were more interested in the agenda of its troops than whether they could actually fight. That's a big part of it. They knew that the stuffing had been knocked out of the US military by its leaders, by Biden, with its obsession with the what they call nowadays the alphabet mafia. LGBTQRXZY, whatever it happens to be. You can't lead an effective military if you don't have effective leaders. And of course, the US military doesn't have any effective leaders at present. They had the big battle in Nevada, I think it's held. Not the Air Force one, but the military one, the Army one. And they had the Americans versus the British and the Swedes, I think, and a few others. And they had these war games, and America comprehensively lost the war games. That's not a good sign when your superpower is losing war games to minor players from Europe. What else was in his planning? Well, obviously, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which was an absolute debacle. What it said is that America can't even protect itself from a few tribal terrorists, let alone a proper army. The only way, and it's true that you can't stay in Afghanistan forever, there had to be some sort of drawdown or withdrawal or whatever. But at the very least, that army should have marched out with flags and a parade and a band, and they all march out together, going out of Afghanistan. See you later. But that's not what happened. There was an absolute rout. There was the most incompetent withdrawal there has ever been of an army, I think, in sort of modern history. And of course, Russia is looking on at that and thinking, well, that lot are not going to do anything at all. And then we had Biden in his sorry about that. Biden in his office, what was it, about 2-3 weeks ago? And he was saying to the national media, oh, well, if Russia just makes a minor incursion, of course, we're not going to do anything. Wow, that's red meat to a Russian, isn't it? Basically, he's saying we're not going to actually get involved. If we do salami tactics, slice by slice, Biden's not going to be involved. So that, there's a green light for starters. And the other green light is he couldn't invade before, where are we? We're in February. He couldn't invade before the end of December because his yacht had not been finished in Germany. He built himself a luxury liner for his own personal use. And they quickly, very, very quickly, launched it and sailed it round to Russia quickly, because otherwise it would have been impounded when it wasn't even finished. Wow. So that arrived in St. Petersburg. I was going to call it Leningrad for a minute. Just in December, I think it was. So, he couldn't invade before then. So there's a whole raft of reasons why he went in at this time. But the main reason, of course, is weakness of the West. He knew that Germany was in his power because they control, it's midwinter. The last thing Germany wants is for all of its gas to be cut off. So he knows that Germany wouldn't get involved. He knows that Germany wouldn't get involved because without America pushing them, Germany won't do anything. They don't really have an effective military. And NATO, now that America has pulled back from NATO, because of course, America used to have thousands and thousands of troops, based in Germany, as did Britain, of course, as well. All of those troops have been pulled out. So now NATO is more dependent on European military than American military, and the European military are simply not pulling together. So NATO is only half the organization it used to be, and is not really fit to make an opposition to someone like Russia. There's too many factions within NATO. They're supposed to be acting together, of course, but they are a whole series of separate nations with their own their own priorities, and they don't necessarily want to get involved, and they're not wielding a very, very effective military. And so, yeah, lots of reasons for Putin to take the decision right now. And of course, the other thing is, of course, he can't wait any longer, because as soon as you get to end of March, mid-March, the ground starts going soft. So he has to go across while it's still frozen. So he needs a winter time. For tanks who want to roam all across the land, they don't want to be stuck on roads, because that's the last place you want to be stuck. You really need to have winter conditions. And so this was really coming up to his last opportunity before you come into the spring. And the mud of spring, which is, of course, what held back the German army in, whenever they invaded. Was it 1940 or 41 or something? I forget when it was. They got held up by the mud, so that's the last thing they want.
That's very interesting. I hadn't considered that. Just so my viewers or our viewers can get a better understanding of that region. A long time ago, the Ukraine was considered to be the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. Is the Ukraine a Lebensraum territory for Russia?
Yes. It shows how dumb our media are. They can't even understand what the guy was saying. So when was this? About a week ago, Putin had a long briefing over what was going to happen. And he literally just laid it out, the reasoning for going into Ukraine. So there was no doubt, even a week ago, that he would be going in, because he laid it all out in black and white. And one of the things he said is that we need to go into Ukraine to denazify the region. And none of them seem to know what that was all about. They're looking for Nazi elements within Ukraine, and they found that there was a particular troop that might have, Nazi elements or something. That's not what he was talking about at all. He was talking about Lebensraum, which, if listeners don't know what it is, Lebensraum is living space. Now, Germany went into the USSR, initially into Ukraine, for Lebensraum. They wanted living space. They wanted land. That's why Hitler went into Ukraine and thence into Russia. It was for Lebensraum. And what he is saying is that the EU has been doing exactly the same. So the EU, from ever since the Ukrainian Revolution, has been looking for Lebensraum. They've been going into Ukraine to expand the EU borders, to make the EU bigger, because they wanted Lebensraum. And so what Putin is doing is he's equating the EU with the Nazi Party. He's calling them Nazis because they are coming into his land, because he regards Ukraine as being Russian, of course, looking for Lebensraum. History repeating itself again, as it always does. Or is it just rhyming? One of the two.
Yeah, very interesting. I was going to ask you, actually, I mean, there are obvious similarities between this alleged invasion and the Germans going into Poland, I suppose, in 1939 to, got to be careful what I say because it's very contentious, but to allegedly liberate the Germans from that part of Poland, which was lost to Germany at the end of the First World War, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, well, this has been used as a tactic, ad infinitum throughout history, isn't it? We're not invading you. We're coming in to protect our people. And that's exactly what Germany said for the Sudetenland. There's Germans down there, so we're invading that part. They said it a little bit for Poland as well. And of course, they had a nice little deal with Russia that Russia would take half of Poland as well under the Ribbentrop Pact. And so they sailed into Poland and took over that area as well. Russia's doing exactly the same. In fact, Russia has been doing the same ever since the end of the Second World War. They did the same to Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. After the Second World War, they piled in. They took over those regions, of course, became part of the USSR, and they literally deported, exiled hundreds of thousands, millions of people from the Baltic states and stuck them into concentration camps, basically, over in the east of Russia somewhere, and then repopulated those regions with ethnic Russians. And then they said, oh, there's ethnic Russians in those lands. Now they're ours. So that's been done, and that's been done in the Ukraine a lot as well, because the history of Ukraine is contentious, of course, but there is a Ukrainian area. But Russia has populated a number of areas within Ukraine, like the Crimea and all of the east. And now it says, oh, that's Russian, because now there's Russian people there. They did the same in Crimea, in the Crimea, and they did the same in in Georgia as well. So the Georgian conflict, when was that? That was back in 2008, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And they did the same there. So Georgia is Georgia. It's definitely it was part of the USSR, of course, but it's a certain ethnic group. And Russia, after the Second World War, deported a lot of people out of Georgia and replaced them with Russians. And then, of course, they said, well, Georgia is Russians. So they marched in and took South Ossetia. And that was a real mess by Hillary Clinton, of course, because she said to Georgia, because Georgia wanted to become Western, and they wanted to become a part of NATO. Sound familiar? And of course, Clinton, wanting to expand Western influence, said, yes, of course. Yes, you can start to become part of NATO, and of course we'll, and they actually asked, and they said, do we have a guarantee that you will come and assist us? And of course, Clinton said, yes, of course, you have our guarantee. You're a part of the West now. So the leader there, who I've forgotten his name for a minute, said, okay, thanks very much. And he invaded South Ossetia, which was the Russian portion of Georgia. And so thinking, of course, he would get the backing of America. So Russia came in with several divisions, totally smashed Georgia, and threw them out of South Ossetia. And of course, the Americans couldn't do a darn thing about it. So, you know, Clinton had made all of these promises, and she couldn't keep to them. And I was surprised, actually, that Russia actually stopped in South Ossetia. I thought they would take the whole of Georgia. Georgia, if people, I should really say where these places are, actually, because a lot of people don't know where they are. Georgia is on the Black Sea, just north of Turkey. It's got a border with Turkey. And it's a very small little state, and it's still vaguely Western. You can still go there to have a holiday there. Lots of interesting archaeology there. It's where Jason and the Argonauts ended up, of course. They ended up in Georgia. And I was there, when was I there? I was there about 8 years ago, I think. And they've got one of the finest Roman military camps I've ever seen anywhere in the whole of the Roman Empire. Wow. So it's a made of stone. So it's not a wooden one, it's a proper permanent camp. And, you know, typical rectangular camp that the Romans made. And it's still all there. It's not been touched ever since, for 1600 years, however long it was since it was built there. So yeah, interesting place, Georgia. But yeah, I did think that Russia would go and take them over at that time.
Okay, just moving onto a slightly different aspect of this story. I noticed today some factions within the alternative right media are claiming that Putin is at war with the cabal, claiming that Trump has teamed up with Russia and China to eliminate the deep state from the Ukraine. There have long been rumours that the Ukraine is at the centre of human trafficking and organ harvesting. Would you give any of this any credence at all?
Can you read out the first bit again? I didn't get the first bit of it.
Sure. So there's some factions within the alternative right media that are claiming that Putin is at war with the cabal, claiming that Trump has teamed up with Russia and China to eliminate the deep state from the Ukraine. So there's long been rumours that the Ukraine is at the centre of human trafficking, organ harvesting, and all sorts of nasty shenanigans.
I can't see anything of substance in that. Ukraine is just a lawless Slavic Eastern nation, and you name it, it's the Wild West. It's like Russia was when I was there in the 90s, early 90s. It's the absolute Wild West. Anything is for sale. You can't really trust any organization because everything is for sale. So when I was in Russia in 91, whenever it was, just after they had the Russian Revolution, when Gorbachev, not Gorbachev, when Yeltsin took over, that tank was still sitting in the center of Moscow when I was there. And yeah, anything was for sale. Nobody knew who owned what. And it was the strong man's paradise. That's how these sort of lawless nations operate, which is why you don't want to go back to a lawless society in the West. There's a lot of people who think, oh no, we'll get rid of the police, we'll get rid of all of the establishment, within our nation, and everything will be fine. Well, no, certainly not in the Slavic East. It won't be fine, because it becomes a strong man's paradise. So when I was there in Russia, in Moscow, I was up in Otradny, which is North Moscow. I had a bank, and my bank, which was in the center of Moscow, had what you might call a hostile takeover. Now, in the West, that means that someone made a bid for your shares on the stock exchange, and they took over that bank by buying it up. In Russia, it meant that 30 armed men with Kalashnikovs stormed the bank, and they said, "This is our bank now. Anyone going to argue?" No one argued, so this became their bank.
Wow.
It was a hostile takeover, and that used to happen all the time. And they had the case of the hostile takeover of a cement factory in Moscow while I was there. And they did the same. They turned up with, 30 armed men and tried to take over the cement factory. But their bid was rejected, because what they didn't realize is they had employed a load of security guards who were equally well armed. And so they fought off the hostile takeover, and their bid was rejected with several deaths. That's the sort of nation that these lawless sort of nations become. And it's very difficult to operate as a normal law-abiding human in these regions. And so I can imagine there's lots of strange things going on in Ukraine because it is lawless. That's the way these nations operate. That's the way a lot of the Near East, not so much the Near East, the Middle East operates. very little goes by the rule of law and the rule of people doing the right thing, people being honest and doing the right thing. It's not that sort of nation, not that sort of part of the world. So to give a complete contrast, I lived in the Netherlands, Holland, for a number of years, and I don't think I ever saw a policeman. And that wasn't because the reason for that was because they didn't need police. It's because the people were intrinsically honest and intrinsically law-abiding, in which case you don't need an oppressive police force. So you live in Russia and you'll have police on every street corner. And if you don't have the police, you'll have the military on every street corner. In Holland, you would never see a policeman or woman in the whole time I was there, because the society and the nation is, intrinsically honest and law-abiding. And that doesn't happen in places like Ukraine and Russia. You need an oppressive police force to keep people in order, which is why the people of Russia like Putin. There's lots of people in the West saying, oh, because of this, the Russian people will depose him and get rid of him because they'll be fed up with him. No, quite the opposite. When I was in Russia, the common adage that they all said is Russia does not work without a hard man in charge. It breaks down into lawlessness and a complete Wild West. And so they appreciate a strong man being there because it's the only way to make Russia work. Because it's not an intrinsically law-abiding society for whatever reason, and we could argue the reasons for hours on that. And so they want a strong man. And look, they've got a strong man. And so him going into Ukraine is probably in accord with what a lot of them want. And his reasons for going into there, if you look to his hour-long broadcast he made before they went in, he wants to be the new Tsar. So he's not even looking back to the USSR. Originally, I thought he was looking back to the USSR and he's wanting to go back to the USSR borders. But no, he was talking about Peter the Great, and he's the new Peter. Peter then Putin. And he wants to regain the borders of Tsarist Russia. And that's a problem because Tsarist Russia had influences going out through Poland, bits of Hungary, bits of Slovakia, all of Ukraine, large chunks of Romania and so on. And you think, hold on a minute, is that his intention? Because if it is, then this is a more serious problem.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I hadn't considered that at all. And so the West at the moment, we're threatening to impose sanctions on Russia. I think that may have started already. I know. I thought that might make you laugh. Strategically, it's not the greatest of ideas, is it? Given the fact that they supply natural gas to half of Europe, and the Russian people are typically far more self-sufficient, hardy people than Westerners. Yes. That's not really going to make a great deal of difference to Putin, is it? I wouldn't have thought.
No, as they say in Russia, when things get hard, we go to the forest, meaning that you can get all the food you require from the vast forests in central Russia. And that's what they used to do. If times get hard, they go to the forest and they pick the forest fruits. That's the sort of mentality you have in Russia. And he's been planning this for 3 or 4 years. All of these considerations have been weighed up. So he'll know exactly the punishment he's going to take and how long he needs to take it and how to counter it. This has all been planned out. So he's not he doesn't care about any stupid sanctions. He knows that if he can last out 10 years, then probably everyone will forget about this, just as they forgot about Crimea. Sanctions were applied. Oh, you're terrible. We're going to block off all trade with Russia. Well, 6 years later, and most of those sanctions started being lifted. So he's only got to last 10 years or so, and everyone will have forgotten about this. And then he's home dry. The other thing he's probably done, because he rather needs some hard currency, and they rather need some consumables, you might say, electronics and all of that sort of thing. I would imagine he's done a deal with China, because China is in the same situation, in terms of hating America. And so it's in their interest, although they have been adversaries, they don't exactly get along, these two, but, such times make very strange bedfellows. Russia's got all the raw materials because China is very short of raw materials. It desperately needs energy because it put up two fingers to Australia. They had been using Australian coal. And because they had a dispute with Australia, they put up two fingers to Australia, and now they don't have enough coal. So they've been having blackouts. All of last year, they were having blackouts across China because they didn't have enough energy. Russia has got those supplies, and Russia is not very good at electronics and consumables. And there's a nice little trade there. So if they partner up, because they both hate the West, and of course China has got its eyes on Taiwan and South Korea, well, there's a nice little partnership for you. And so Russia will have no concerns whatsoever if it's done a little deal with China. It will get all of the foreign currency it requires, and it'll get all of the consumables it requires for its population. And it's completely independent of the West. It doesn't care.
Yeah. How relevant is Turkey to this situation, Ralph?
Well, that depends on how far Putin wants to take this. What are his intentions? Initially, I thought he would be canny and just take Eastern Ukraine, because Eastern Ukraine is the Russian part of Ukraine. Lots of Russian speakers there. And they would be good citizens to the Russian Empire. If he goes into Western Ukraine, they are very independent. These are the people in Eastern Ukraine who cheered the German army crossing into Ukraine in 1942, whenever it was. They wanted the Germans there because they hated Russia so much. Remember, it's the the Russians have this very oppressive political system. That's why when you go to places like Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania, if you go to the center of town, the biggest thing in the center of town is the Museum of the Occupation. The occupation, not by the Germans, the occupation by the Russians, because they're the ones who oppressed them, who deported all of their people out into Eastern Russia, and suppressed them for 50 years, however long it was. And when I was there in Latvia, they had a bit of a riot, and so I was interested in what was going on. And the Latvians had built a large monument to the Waffen SS. And they had built this memorial to the Waffen SS. And the EU turned around and said, you've got to take it down. You can't be in the EU and have this monument in the center of Latvia. And you've got to ask yourself, well, why would they want such a monument? Well, because they hated the Russians so much. And it was the Germans who liberated them from Russian control.
Mm.
You can see how your perspective can change if you're in a different nation with different priorities.
Mm.
And a lot of people in the West don't understand that. They have these, you know, one size all branding of people. SS, oh, terrible people. No, the Baltic states didn't say that, because they were liberators to them, because they had an even worse foe out to the east, and that was Russia. So how far will Putin take this? In his strategy at present, it sort of looks like he might want to take over the whole of Ukraine, which is ambitious, because now you're pushing right up to the borders of NATO. And he was talking about taking Kaliningrad. And again, for people who don't know these places, he wanted to take Moldova, which is on the west of Ukraine, a little independent state that butts up against Romania. And he wanted to take Kaliningrad, which is up in the Baltics. It's one of these states that's completely separate from Russia at present. You know, it's cut off by Lithuania. And he wants to take that as well and join that up with Belarus, which is the nation that's above Ukraine. Well, that's tricky, because if he wants to join Kaliningrad into Russia, he has to take Lithuania out. Now, that's going to be a problem, because he's going to go up against NATO there, because all of the Baltic states are now considered a part of NATO. And there's supposed to be this response where if one member of NATO is attacked, then all of the others will come to their aid. But Russia is probably calculating that the NATO alliance, because America is not there very much at present, is probably quite weak and divided. You know, does France really want to go to the Baltic states to help Lithuania? Will Spain go there? Will Italy go there? You can see the problems of getting a consensus within NATO. And so he might be calculating that this is a golden opportunity to go into some of these extra places. And one of the places he might be wanting to go to is to go down onto the Mediterranean, because Russia has always wanted a Mediterranean port and a Mediterranean coastline. And it doesn't really have one at present. All it's got is it's got a coastline with Syria at present, because it's got a large contingent of people in Syria, of course, helping out Assad. And that's the only sort of part of the Mediterranean that it's got at present. And it really would like a Mediterranean port city. And while I don't think he would invade Turkey, it's not beyond the realms of possibility that he would strike up an association with Turkey.
But isn't Turkey part of NATO, Ralph?
That's an odd thing. It is. It's part of NATO. But why on earth is Turkey a part of NATO? They have worked against the West in every single dispute over the last century. They were on the wrong side in the First World War. They were on the wrong side in the Second World War. And these are the people who kicked all of the Greeks. Because remember, Turkey used to be Greek. It wasn't Turkish. Right up until 1922, Turkey was Greek and Armenian. And then they had the great genocide of the Armenians, where 3 million Armenians were killed. And they had the great genocide of the Greeks. And because places like Smyrna, which is Izmir nowadays, was the great cosmopolitan city on the west coast of Anatolia. If you wanted an example of multiculturalism, it would have been Smyrna, which was known as the city of the Levantines, because there were a lot of people there from Lebanon at the time. And it was a great Western city, mostly Greek. And then the Turks came along and burnt it to the ground. And they killed and exiled 1 million Greeks in doing so. And there's a fantastic little tale of, because they were all stuck down on the port side. So you had the port city, the port area of Smyrna had 500,000 people sitting on the port, all being burnt and slaughtered by the Turks. And there were 20 battleships, Western battleships, sitting in the port doing nothing. Because like this standoff with Ukraine, where America and the EU won't go into Ukraine to help them, none of those Western battleships would go in to help the Greeks that were being murdered on the port side, literally being burnt and shot and raped and whatever. And they had this administrator from the YMCA. It's one of these weird stories that comes out of events like this. And he had been in Smyrna, and he managed to get himself evacuated to Greece, which is due west of Smyrna. And he went down to Athens, and he made such a fuss about this that nobody was doing anything to help the Greeks, that the Greeks made him an admiral in the Greek Navy. So he went from being a YMC administrator to an admiral in 3 days. And that gave him the power to requisition ships. So he requisitioned 30 ships from Greece, sailed across to Smyrna, and took these people into safety. And it took hundreds of thousands. I mean, we're not talking a little expedition. He took something like 350,000 people to safety. This was 1922. It's not a long time ago. This is 1922. And again, Turkey was being the adversary against the West, as they've always been. So how on earth, why on earth did they become a part of NATO? The most unreliable portion of NATO, I would say, there's ever been. I think it's because people don't study history. If they'd known their history, they would have known not to touch Turkey with a barge pole, let alone put them in as a part of NATO. So no, I don't consider them to be a part of NATO because they're not trustworthy enough.
Go on.
The problem with Turkey at present is it's bankrupt. Completely and utterly bankrupt. And there's no good reason why we should be dealing with Turkey at all. Ever since Erdogan took over, which was in 2010-ish, I think, something of that nature, Turkey was supposed to be a secular society. So of all of the Islamic countries, it was supposed to be the most secular. And it sort of was in the West, not in the East. It was still very Islamic. I mean, for instance, in Turkey, when I was there, because I used to live in Turkey as well, there's not many places I haven't lived at.
I was going to say, anywhere you haven't lived?
I was down there for 5 years, so I know it quite well. I know Greece and Turkey. I used to hop around the islands. In Turkey, women were not even allowed to wear a headscarf, let alone a burqa. They were forbidden. Government institutions and all schools were not allowed to be religious. They all had to be secular. And that's how it ran ever since, 1922, when Ataturk came to power, right up until 2010, when Erdogan took over. And he tried to turn it back into an Islamic caliphate. He wanted to resurrect, again, he's a little bit like Putin, who wants to become the new Tsar. Well, Erdogan wants to become the new caliph of the Ottoman Empire, a new Ottoman Empire. And so he changed all of this. And so he put a mosque in every school. He made wearing the burqa compulsory in various places, you know, in government institutions, because his wife does. It's not exactly the burqa. It's like a raincoat and a headscarf, which completely covers their women up. And how they wear it, I don't know, because you'll go into central Turkey, so, you know, going into Ankara, and it's 40 degrees outside. And all of the women are in jumpers and raincoats and headscarves. How on earth do they live like that? I've got no idea. Anyway, and he instituted this new regime, which went against everything that Turkey had stood for before, especially their armed forces, because the armed forces in Turkey were the bastion of secularism, a bit like in Egypt and many of these other places, Libya, Jordan. It's always the army is the bastion of secularism, maintaining secular standards as opposed to Islamic standards. I'm not sure why the army is always like that, but it is, and it certainly was in Turkey. And of course, they were aghast at all of this Islamification of Turkey, which is why you had the coup a few years ago, because that was led by the army and the air force, because they saw this as a betrayal of everything that Ataturk had done back in the 1920s. And that, of course, failed. Erdogan won that particular battle against his people. And he instituted Islamic economy. So it was a sort of strange blend of communism and capitalism, plus he has the Islamic policy on interest, that you're not allowed to charge interest and so on. And so he decided, so he was very generous with spending, which has been a problem for a long time over there. And then he had this idea that if interest rates were increasing and your currency was going down on the foreign exchange markets, what you should do is decrease the interest rate, which is the total opposite of, you know, standard economic response to a recession. And of course, the money is just devalued over there. So he's running at present with 100% inflation rate in Turkey, and they are completely bankrupt. They depend on foreign gas and foreign coal for energy, because they have no resources themselves. Turkey has no fossil fuels whatsoever. So they're totally dependent on foreign imports, and they don't have the money to buy it. So they have no foreign currency reserves. That's all been spent. They've now made a law in Turkey saying that if you have any gold, you must give all of your gold to the government, whether it's jewelry or money or bullion or whatever you've got. All gold has to be given to the government for free. Of course, you have to give it up because it's run out of foreign currency reserves. So the whole of Turkey is utterly bankrupt, ripe for the plucking, you might say.
Yeah.
And so while I don't think Putin would go into Turkey and actually invade, it wouldn't be in their interest, they could certainly make a valuable ally. Hey, Erdogan, we've got a bit of gas and coal for you if you want, you know, as long as you do our bidding, as long as you allow us free reign to go through your country and get to Syria, so we don't have problems getting to Syria anymore, and as long as we can have a naval base, you know, on the Mediterranean somewhere.
It's a very interesting situation, isn't it? Given that Turkey is a member of NATO.
Yeah,
it's very,
but
very,
you know, if they're bankrupt, what are they going to do? Are we going to bail out Turkey just because they're a part of NATO? I don't think so. I think Erdogan will just play the double game, and he will have Russia in his nation while still being technically a part of NATO, and just, not tell anyone about it.
Mm.
So yeah, the further expansion of, the aims of Putin are going to be very interesting. Is he going to be satisfied with Ukraine? He's made a blatant and decisive incursion into Ukraine, which of course all of the Western commentators were saying, oh no, he'd never do that, because this is the whole reason he's going in there, is because nobody in the West can imagine someone not being nice. All of the leaders in the West are so nice. They would never attack someone. They're all just, they're all just concerned with the alphabet mafia, Never mind how effective your army is, how many transvestites do you have in them? That's all, And of course, Russia is the complete opposite. That sort of thing doesn't worry them whatsoever. They're probably shaking their heads in disbelief at all of this nonsense in the West. So they saw how weak we were. I mean, the standard comment when I was in Russia, again, this was in the 90s, so it was very, very poor then. And as I say, it was a complete Wild West. Everything was for sale. I was even offered cruise missiles. I could have a cruise missile for 5,000 euros. But he said you can't have one with a warhead. You can only have the cruise missile, but no warheads. Oh, okay, thanks very much.
I think I'll leave it.
But the standard saying used to be, we wish we had your problems. Talking about the West. We wish we had your problems. Because their problems are so much more severe than talking about alphabet communities. They have real problems in Russia, especially in the 90s. But even now, there's an awful lot of poverty in Russia, especially in the agricultural regions. It's very, very poor. And while I'm on here actually talking about this, one thing America does not get much praise for during the 90s when the wall came down. And after Perestroika, so when Russia collapsed completely and had its little civil war, no one gave America any credit for the assistance it gave to Russia at that time, which probably saved us from a third world war. The first thing that they did is they distributed chickens because Russia was starving. And they called them bushwings while I was there. And every family had a bushwing, which was a chicken from America, which saved the people from starvation. And the other major thing they did is they went in with, I think it was $1 billion. It was a lot of money. Considering this was the 1990s, $1 billion was a lot of money. And they went to the nuclear cities in Russia. I don't know if you know, but they have several cities which control the nuclear industry in Russia, especially for weapons grade nuclear weapons. And these are sort of enclosed cities, they're not even on the maps, nobody knows where they are, but they're these closed cities where they have a wall around them and you can only go in with a pass and so on. And that was a danger because they had this technology and they had the materials and everyone was bankrupt and starving, and they could sell that to anybody. And there was a great fear that this information and these weapons could actually leak out and get into the Middle East, perhaps. You can imagine Saudi Arabia or Iran with nuclear weapons, or Iraq at that time. And that was the last thing anybody wanted. So they actually went to these closed cities and said, look, here's $100 million. You can buy whatever you like, but don't sell your weapons and don't sell your expertise. And we'll just keep feeding you. You know, whatever you want, we'll give it to you. But don't sell those weapons. And that was not really highlighted at all in the West. And that saved the proliferation of these nuclear materials throughout the world at that time, which was a jolly good thing that they actually did that.
Who was the president of America at that time? Was it Clinton?
It was Bush.
It was Bush. Wow.
Bush Jr., yeah.
Who would have thought it? Bush Jr. saving the day.
Yeah. That's why they were called bushwings.
Oh, yeah, right.
Bush chickens, yeah.
Okay. Before we close then, Ralph, put you on the spot slightly. How do you see this situation playing out, if you had to say?
It depends how well this goes, because I get the impression it's not going very well. As I said in my little Odessa, it's on my website if anyone wants to see it, on my Facebook site, which is ralphellis.144. I did this little comparison between Ukraine and Odessa. And I mentioned in that little piece that sometimes it's best not to invade, because people might find out how weak you are after you invade. And the classic example of this is the Near East during the Yom Kippur and the Six-Day War. And if people are not familiar with those wars, the first one was the Six-Day War, when 3/4 nations decided to attack Israel simultaneously, from Egypt, from Jordan, from Syria, from Lebanon. And they all came in together at the same time. And they were soundly defeated within 6 days. All of those armies were defeated by little tiny Israel. And Israel it's smaller than Wales. You know, it's a small, little, tiny place with a small population of that time. I think it had about 6 million people or something. And then they did the same with the Yom Kippur War. So again, they were saber rattling. The speeches that Egypt gave were obvious. All of their army was lined up on the southern border of Israel, ready to attack. And so Israel led a preemptive attack and destroyed all of the armies of Egypt and Syria and Jordan. And they were on their way to Cairo and on their way to Damascus. And it was only the Russians intervening and said, you've got to stop this, that actually stopped them going up to those capitals. Now, how does this relate to what's happening in Ukraine? Well, the problem is that the weapons that Egypt and Syria had were all Russian on both occasions. And so they went in with something like, it was like 20,000 artillery pieces, you know? It was huge forces that ran into Israel, and they were all destroyed. Now, that's a problem if you're selling arms around the world, to have this wonderful demonstration that all your arms can be so easily countered by a little place like Israel. And Israel was running on second-hand equipment, because everyone says that, oh, you know, Israel is you know, controlled by America. It's, you know, funded by America. At the time, America wouldn't give them any arms. And so what Israel had done is they had bought up Second World War tanks and fitted new guns to them. So they brought out, I think they called it the Firefly, which was the old American Second World War tank. What was that one called? Little tiny tank. It wasn't very good, that they used in the D-Day landings and so on. It was an absolute useless tank because it only had a pea shooter on the front. So the Israelis bought up all of these second-hand World War II tanks and stuck a decent gun on the top of it and called it the Firefly. And they routed the whole of the Egyptian and Syrian armies using these tanks, and a few Challengers from Britain. They had some Challenger tanks as well. And that was a problem for Russia because it showed that their equipment was maybe not up to the job. And we've seen this time and time again. When Russia goes to war, its equipment actually doesn't fare very well. Mm. And we have this problem in the Ukraine. First of all, we had some very strange tactics. You would have thought they would have gone in with 2 or 3 days of air assault on Ukraine before sending in the troops. And they had like 5 hours of air assault and then sent in the troops. And you've got to wonder why that is. I mean, that's a very strange thing to do in modern warfare terms, especially as they had nearly guaranteed air superiority over Ukraine. There's only 2 reasons for that. It's either bravado, and there's a lot of bravado in these Eastern nations, where, you know, the army says, well, we can take them on, you know, without the Air Force softening them up first. Or the Russian Air Force is not actually up to the job at present. One of the 2, not entirely sure which. I imagine myself it's probably the Air Force is not up to scratch, because they have a problem with reliability with Russian aircraft. Very good aircraft. I mean, I was there in Russia working in the aerospace industry in Russia for 2 years. So I know their aerospace industry quite well. And the designs are fantastic. The execution, the manufacturing, is dire, which is why Russia has never come into the civil aviation market and taken over the civil aviation. Even though their aircraft are half the price of a Boeing or an Airbus, they've never taken over any significant slice in the commercial aviation market, because their aircraft are not very reliable. They had this wonderful Sukhoi Superjet, I think they called it. It's a sort of, it's just a bit smaller than an Airbus A320. It's a bit like the Airbus A220, which is a new one they've brought out. So that sort of single aisle size. And it was a really good ship. And people started to buy it in the West. But it wasn't reliable. They were getting like a 60% dispatch rate, whereas most Western aircraft normally run on a 98 or 99% dispatch rate, and the Sukhoi was getting 60%. And so last time I went to Shannon Airport always has lots of ties with Russia. Southern Ireland is always allied with Russia, which says quite a lot. So anyway, out in Shannon, they had all of these Sukhois all lined up. They'd all been given back because they couldn't operate them, because they were so unreliable. And I think they've got the same problem with the Russian military and the Air Force. Great aircraft, but not terribly reliable. So when you actually want to use them, they're not going to work. They had this problem when they sent them across to Syria. They wanted to display a force over in Syria when that was sort of blowing up over in Syria a few years back. So they sent out the their aircraft carrier to Syria, and it chugged its way out to Syria at 10 knots, which shows that there's something deeply amiss. Puffing out, they called it Puffing Billy in the end. Black smoke everywhere. There was a joke that it used to run on old car tires, you know. Black smoke everywhere. And it got to Syria, and 5 of the aircraft crashed. And then it came back again. Not exactly. When you consider what America does because Russia only has 1 aircraft carrier. America has 12 fleets, not just aircraft carriers. They all travel as a fleet with hundreds of aircraft on board. and they might lose one a year or something. And Russia has this real problem with their aircraft carrier, and they had to send it back to Russia again because the thing broke down. I get the impression that there's some of that going on over in Ukraine. So is this going to pay off to them? Because when I was coming back to my Odessa thing, is I said, yeah, I've just said this, hadn't I? Sometimes it's better to posture on your borders rather than proving that you're incompetent. And they've gone bravely into Ukraine with equipment which might not be up to the job. And Britain has sent out 2,000 NLAWs, not in-laws. I mean, they would be devastating, but NLAWs. NLAW is like it's like a successor to the Panzerfaust in Germany, which is a short-range anti-tank missile. And they're proving very effective because the Russians are coming in without sufficient air cover to cover their tanks, and they're getting knocked out. And we sent over enough of these missiles to take out every single Russian tank. Are they going to get bogged down because they don't have the equipment to take on Ukraine, even without, you know, NATO actually doing anything apart from maybe shoving some armaments across the border somewhere? NATO is not going to get involved because, you know, if we want NATO to do something like fly aircraft, you know, over Ukraine, well, they have to come from somewhere. And do the Hungarians want them coming out of their airports, or the Slovakians or the Polish, so that Russia might retaliate against them with their aircraft? You know, do they want to get involved to that degree? Probably not. So Ukraine is on its own. But nevertheless, I get the impression that it's going to be much harder than Russia thought to take on Ukraine. And so their ambitions, if Putin wanted to become the next Tsar and take over the, you know, Tsarist Russia, he's not going to be able to do it. You know, I think he's going to run out of steam in Ukraine and take a bit of a bloody nose and not be able to proceed any further. Well, that's my hope, because the other one, of course, he's bound to go into is he's going to go into Baku. You know, he wants oil. He wants to corner the oil market. You know, if you're going to take over Ukraine, you might as well take over Georgia and Azerbaijan, which are down there, you know, next to the Black Sea, between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. And of course, Baku is the center of the oil industry in that part of the world. And that is going to be, you know, next on the list. But if he takes a real bloody nose in Ukraine and the equipment doesn't work as well as they thought it was going to, then I think this will ground to a halt. I mean, just for instance, you know, without looking at the military side of it, if any of you have ever watched those car crash compilations on the on YouTube, there's lots of these videos about car crashes, and most of them come out of Russia, because for many, many years they've had dash cams in Russia, because you had to have a dash cam to stop people extorting you. You know, people used to fake crashes and claim against your insurance and so on. And so you had to have a dash cam, and they've had them for years and years over in Russia. But watch for the number of wheels that come off trucks going in Russia. There's wheels flying everywhere, you know. Last time you were going on a British or European motorway, when have you ever seen a wheel come off a truck? You know, that is Russian engineering. Great, it works, but it's just not terribly reliable. And you know, if your tank throws a track, well, you know, you don't have a tank anymore. You've got a pillbox, and it's not going to work. So that's what I'm hoping. I'm hoping it'll stop in Ukraine, and they'll have to stop to the east of the Dnieper, the river that goes through the center of Ukraine. And they'll have to withdraw from the west of Ukraine, and we'll end up with a split Ukraine. And the West will take Western Ukraine, and Russia will take Eastern Ukraine, which is where most of the Russians live anyway. And that, I hope, will be the end of that, and it won't go any further.
Let's hope so.
I hope so, yes.
Thanks, Ralph. That's an eye-opening, thought-provoking insight of what's going on that you won't see on the BBC, that's for certain.
It certainly won't.
Yeah, it might be good to have a follow-up maybe in a week or two.
Yeah, to see how it's going, yes.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Ralph. Hope you enjoyed that, everyone. Please like, share and subscribe, and we'll see you again soon. Cheers, Ralph.
Thank you.